Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride. And you join us this evening for a special edition of Scotland at 7. We don't normally broadcast on a Friday evening, but it is the 75th anniversary of VE Day, when the Allies defeated Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And we wanted to just talk a bit about that and give it the commemoration that we think it deserves. First of all, though, we will just give you a quick rundown of today's headlines. And the first among those is the coronavirus statistics update. And as of 2 p.m. today in Scotland, there have been a total of 69,191 coronavirus tests concluded. Of those, 56,042 were confirmed negative and 13,149 tests were positive. Last night, 84 patients were in intensive care, with 75 of those having tested positive. And there were a total of 1,168 people in hospital with either confirmed or suspected COVID-19. And again, those are both drops from the previous day. There is an increase of 225 confirmed new cases across the country since yesterday, though. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection has sadly risen to 1,811. Now, this number does only include those who have died in hospital having received a positive test. The latest UK daily figures available show that 31,241 patients who tested positive have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 626. And for the whole UK numbers, that number does now refer to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And in the rest of the news, events across Europe today mark the 75th anniversary of the Allied defeat of the Nazi regime in Germany in 1945. In the UK, the day has been marked by street parties and Red Arrows flypasts, while in Germany, a special one-day public holiday was given in Berlin to mark the return of democracy and freedom to the country. Over 90% of people who responded to surveys carried out for the Scottish Government during April agreed that by remaining at home, they would be saving lives and protecting the NHS. The research by Ipsos Murray and YouGov also showed trust in their Scottish Government's handling of the crisis remains high. Scottish Welfare Fund monthly figures released today show that crisis grant applications during March were almost 60% higher than for the same month last year. The figures come as the SNP and the Scottish Government have repeatedly called for major changes to the social security system, including the introduction of a universal basic income. A fund launched last week to provide grants for small and medium-sized businesses affected by the coronavirus is to be doubled from £45 million to £90 million. The First Minister announced the increase in the pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund to help meet existing demand. And in a letter to UK Government Business Secretary Alok Sharma, Fiona Hislop, the Scottish Government Economy Secretary, underlined her desire for a genuine four-nations approach and called on the UK Government to work collectively with businesses and trade unions to shape its draft Safer Workplaces guidance and to ensure it reflects differences across the devolved administrations. And finally, in the US, congressional investigators in Washington are demanding information about coronavirus financial support that the Trump Organization has requested from foreign governments, including the UK. The demand for information follows a media report that said that the Trump Organization was seeking UK and Irish bailout funds to cover wages of employees who had been furloughed from the company's golf properties due to the pandemic. And now, as we move on to our big discussion this evening, I'd like to introduce two guests. On this side of me, we have Professor Murray Pittock, a historian at the University of Glasgow. And on this side of me, we have Ellen Höfer, a longtime friend of the show, our creative director of EU Citizens for an Independent Scotland, and still, I think, a German citizen. Yeah. But you are, of course, now a new Scot. You do very much consider yourself Scottish now. Yeah, fair enough. Well, we were happy to claim you, it must be said. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was, when I was Googling just to see what was happening around the rest of Europe, and I noticed that the headlines in Britain almost all referred to VE Day celebrations, whereas in Germany and France and other parts of Europe, it was very much referred to as a commemoration. Now, Ellen, obviously, in Germany, it's not necessarily a day of celebration. While we may think of the UK as having liberated Germany, for a lot of Germans at the time, it was defeat. And that was, so it's not necessarily about celebrating victory there as it is about remembering the loss, remembering the kind of the impact of the war. Could you tell us a wee bit about how Germany remembers the war in that sense?
I mean, for me, it's an interesting question because, of course, I've lived away from Germany longer now than, I've stayed in the UK longer than I lived in Germany. But I do know that having gone to school in Germany and spent my entire school career there, we never went through a single year without talking about the war and what happened during this era. I don't think it's so much that we're talking about defeat. Even at the time, I think both the UK, the rest of the world, and Germany were just fed up with war, relieved that something was over. I'm sure there was a mass tragedy and a lot of mixed feelings, but more than anything, the end of a war hails in the beginning of democracy again. And I think there was a lot of that to look forward to. But it was a really uncertain time in the way that we celebrate. This topic is quite difficult for me. It really very much reminds me of the whole poppy debate and why I don't wear a poppy when the time comes every year. It's about understanding that war is a tragedy for everyone involved. And I think the best way to honor those that fell during the war, the best way of sacrificing or understanding and accepting and respecting the sacrifices that had to be made in order to win this war is by making good policies today, by engaging, by protecting each other, by having respect and by having solidarity for each other's struggles. And I think that is much more important than any symbolic single day or single symbolic sign. Sure,
yeah. And Murray, you're, I hope so this isn't too insulting to say, but you're a little bit older than Ellen and I. I wonder, the way that Britain has responded to this, this is the 75th anniversary. Now, I'm old enough to remember the 50th anniversary, and I don't remember it being as maybe jingoistic as it seems to be this time around. Now, that might be my, perceptions growing more cynical the older I get, but do you get that same sense?
Oh, I think there's very little doubt of that. The celebration of VE Day is a relatively modern development, at least at this level. The 60th anniversary passed almost unnoticed. The 50th anniversary was, as you say, very much more low-key. And what you're seeing is fundamentally the same thing as you started to see with World War I about 10 or 15 years ago, but it's less pronounced because World War I was a more controversial war than World War II. That is that when the veterans die, memory becomes something selective, something which feeds the needs of a culture who never engaged in the conflict that it's remembering. And that's what's happened, and that's why VE Day has become central. Of course, I'm afraid, I think the 75th anniversary, whether or not you take the Daily Mail's view of it as victory over Europe, is inevitably contaminated with the outcome of Brexit. And I have to say that there is a connection right the way back to this period, because it was only about 8 or 9 years ago in Scotland that the then German Consul General raised a flag of warning about the way in which World War II was taught in schools and the insistence on Germany and German guilt, which was very much part of the curriculum. And I think that's something which has played into people's minds. I think Germany has dealt with the terrible legacy of war by understanding what really went on and getting past it. And I don't think that that's happened in the UK.
Yeah, Ellen, if I could come to you again on that question, how does the German educational system specifically? You mentioned that a year didn't go by at school where it wasn't mentioned. How does that start at a very young age? I mean, how quickly are German kids taught about that history and how important it is that they avoid that history repeating itself?
For me, it started in second grade. From what I can remember, I'm not sure if that was the actual start, but it's quite a while back. But I really cannot remember a year at school where this was not a topic, and I'm not sure we have overcome it. I think the real good news is that my generation is the first generation, our generation is the first generation that has an opportunity to take the lessons from the war without taking too much of the trauma. We need to remember that our grandparents went through it. We need to remember that their children were raised in households that were deeply traumatized by the war. And we are the first generation that has had enough of a buffer in between those generational divides. I mean, the war ended, but my own father and his mother, they were considered foreigners because she was an Italian. And so just because the war ends doesn't mean the attitude suddenly ceased to be, racist. So they encountered the same trauma over and over, but not at the same intensity and not on a state-sanctioned sort of level.
Mm-hmm. And in Germany, of course, things like Holocaust denial have become illegal. There's still this very strong sense that that Nazi thinking has to be squashed as much as possible, has to be kind of pushed out of polite society wherever it emerges. To what extent do you think that's a benefit to German society, given that here, the idea of making any sort of speech illegal is still relatively, anathema. We don't like that idea. To what extent do you think that has helped Germany to kind of move beyond that period in its history?
I mean, Germany is not through it all, in the same way that no country in the world can rightfully claim that we are away and completely over racism and fascism. I think Germany and the way that we do education has really changed the likelihood of this reoccurring in Germany. I can see much bigger chances here in the UK of the same fascist ideology sticking. And when we're talking about Brexit, to me, there's absolutely no doubt that a lot of the rhetoric surrounding that topic absolutely was on the level of fascist rhetoric and propaganda, specifically against EU citizens. Earlier today, I saw a repost on Twitter by Colin Dunn, indie poster boy, and he said the greatest celebration of VE Day was the formation of the EU, and the UK is leaving it. And that really sums it up very nicely as far as I'm concerned. We are turning our backs on our friends. We're doing it without ifs and buts, even if it's ifs and buts of the constituent parts that make up the UK. And I can't see that happening. Part of the reformation of Germany was about democracy that functioned to the best of its abilities for all parts of Germany. Especially in the context of independence, I often get asked, so how would you feel if Bavaria decided to go its own way? And I'm like, first of all, not very likely. And secondly, go them. If that's the way that the majority of that population chooses, I don't think there would be a massive blackmail campaign mounted against that sort of aspiration.
Yeah. And Murray, to come to you now, this idea of that Brexit and the war metaphors that we see even now around the coronavirus, and even every time England plays Germany at football, we see these especially Second World War metaphors just pushed non-stop. What is it about Britain that you think we're so fixated on the Second World War? Why is that such a pivotal issue for Britain, and why does it have this emotional resonance that gets attached to so many other things?
Well, that's a very big question, but there are at least three or four answers to it. One of them is quite simple. This is the last time in which Britain and its dominions and colonies presented itself as a global power, and that's very important, especially since it ended up on the winning side. The second is that it's seen as a time of social cohesion, and there's a feeling which isn't just down to the contemporary world, but has been there for a long time, that actually the UK isn't really socially cohesive. The more aggressively it presents itself as socially and nationally cohesive, the more the anxiety that it isn't is revealed. And the war stands for a time when it was. In fact, a lot of the things that we're kind of freeing up and changing in Thurt's society were put a stop to, in a sense. The clock was stopped by the war, went back to a very much more conservative command and control society. The third is, and this is what we might call I won't say it's Corbynite, but the war has become very important to both the Conservative and Labour parties because it's seen as ushering in Attlee socialism. And one of the things about the Labour Party is that it generally dislikes all the people who became Labour prime ministers because they sold the pass in some way or another, from Wilson to Blair. The exception to that, or MacDonald, in fact, to Blair, the exception to that is Attlee. And Attlee delivers because he brings the war spirit into the peace community, creates or allows to be created as part of the Bevanite agenda, the National Health Service, brings together a huge amount of social solidarity across Britain, which replicates in 45-51 the experience of 39-45. And those three things put together, imperial power, national cohesion, and socialist millenarianism, if you like, they are very powerfully part of the World War II myth.
Yeah. I mean, we could, I think, talk about this particular topic all night, but I would like to talk a bit more about the war itself. And Murray, one of the most famous stories now, it's not something I had ever heard as a younger person, but it's become a much more well-known story now, is the story of the 51st Highland Division in Dunkirk. Obviously, most people have heard the story about Dunkirk. There's been a huge film made about it now. But the 51st Highlanders were kind of left behind there. I wonder if you could tell us just a wee bit about that story as one of the examples of what Scots soldiers sacrificed during the war.
Well, that was a large and early sacrifice. The 51st Highland Division, together with French forces, was engaged in a fighting retreat towards Dunkirk in order fundamentally to buy time for the British Expeditionary Force, who were isolated at Dunkirk. And in the end, quite a lot of they were successful. They fought a really good fighting retreat, and about 10,000 of them were taken prisoner. So, but of so there were 10,000 POWs out of that group who served most of the war in Germany. Though even they were very spirited, because even while they were being taken to POW camps, about 300 of them escaped on the march and returned to Great Britain. And one of the things is, I mean, I think we got to that there's a kind of story around the 51st Highland Division that it was Britain letting down Scottish troops. Now you can have that reading, but if you look at contemporary journals like Punch, the front cover of Punch in 1940 shows a Scottish soldier, relevant front cover, shows a Scottish soldier on the front cover, saying that they were, with speaking mildly Scots, to say that they will defend Britain's honour and they're more trustworthy to do it than other people. And there was a widespread view that that was the case. It was the legend, if you like, of the Marshal Scott, particularly the Highland Marshal Scott, that ultimately lay behind the use of the 51st Highland Division and a belief in its high morale to secure a fighting retreat towards Dunkirk.
Yeah, I mean, is that myth of or not even myth, but that stereotype of the fighting Scot, does that go a lot further back in history?
Oh, it absolutely does. I mean, I would say it is probably a bit of a myth if you look at the way that various regiments performed. Though it was a very important myth, and it was undoubtedly true in some cases. That it goes back to the attempt to accommodate Scots into the British Army after Culloden, that they were seen as bringing something new, something dynamic, and soon that became a story about how they had kind of misplaced loyalties in the Jacobite era, and now they were real. They understood the way things really were. They were now great British patriots, and they would deliver for the British Empire, and that became a huge part of the mythology of the Scottish soldier in the 19th century. To the 1885, the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, the British Commander-in-Chief, Garnet Wolseley, was an Irishman, wanted to say that the Irish troops had done quite a lot. And the Liverpool Echo, no less, leaving aside the Scottish press, said, we mustn't take away from the enormous national power and national effort that the Scots troops brought here, as in so many other fields. It was absolutely central to the British Marshal's story, the performance of the Scottish troops and Scottish regiments.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we know that Scots had a disproportionate impact on the governance of the empire, and of course, there were a lot of Scots soldiers as well in some of the more far-flung campaigns of the war, places like Burma. Could you talk a wee bit about the impact of Scottish soldiers on that campaign, which again is one of the campaigns that we hear less about, certainly when we talk about VE Day. Burma was obviously in the Asian theatre. Could you tell us a bit about how Scotland's soldiers were involved there?
Well, I mean, just as the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders suffered heavy losses in the retreat to Dunkirk with the 51st, so the Royal Scots were very much engaged in the Burma campaign. I think one of the tragedies of that campaign is that about a million British forces in theatre at the time, but it's almost and it effectively led to the successful defence of India, but it's almost never covered and remembered. It's not part of our cultural memory of the war, which is so European to balance America's Pacific memory of the war. So Scottish troops very much involved in the Burma campaign, but a forgotten campaign. It seems that after the fall of Singapore, we don't necessarily want to remember the efforts of British troops in 1942-44 in East Asia.
Yeah, and of course, Burma and campaigns in North Africa were apparently some of the worst campaigns to be part of, weren't they?
They absolutely were. I mean, conditions in Burma were, I mean, they're difficult anyway, but their supply conditions for the troops were appalling. And the kind of tough conditions that were in North Africa probably helped to lead David Stirling, Scotsman from Perthshire, to develop the SAS in 1941 in North Africa. Yeah, it's in a sense it gave the illusion of RAF power extending beyond the RAF, but it was also, of course, a crack special forces unit, which it remains today, and that was created by a Scotsman on the North African campaign and subsequently trained alongside UK commandos and Free French commandos in Scotland itself at Achnacarry, where Commander basic training was carried out, and at Inverary, where the combined training college for the commando trained 250,000 commandos during World War II.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as well, in Burma especially, it wasn't just, white British soldiers going over there. There were a lot of colonial soldiers involved as well, a lot of Indian soldiers and others.
I think we really forget this, and it's been a feature of the memory of war which has disturbed me over the last 30 or 40 years. If you look even at feature films like, to put it no higher, Charge of the Light Brigade, Zulu Dawn, you see the multinational nature of British forces represented. But if you go into a more modern venue, into Sharp or into Master and Commander, if you go to the way in which these wars are represented now, right up to including World War II, there is a reluctance to accept that they were, I mean, never mind the huge numbers of Scots and Irish, that there were forces from the British Empire who were absolutely critical. And actually, the Canadians made this film about World War One, Passchendaele, in 2006, partly to say, look, we were there, we made a huge contribution, and you've forgotten all about us. And that's been an interesting thing about the way this war is, the First and Second World Wars have been remembered. We don't remember the Indian troops in World War One in the trenches in the Western Front, and there were Indian troops in the trenches in the Western Front, and we don't remember the Imperial troops who are by far the vast majority of the forces engaged in Burma.
Yeah. On that note, we do have a poem here now. I'm going to read it, so I do apologise in advance. This is by Hamish Henderson, poet obviously from Blairgowrie. He served in North Africa and Italy during the war, and this extract is from his first elegy. And once we finish with this, we're going to hear from Stephen Granger, our piper who's out on the shores of Loch Lomond, who's going to play When the Battle's O'er, which is a traditional military retreat march. But this, as I said, is an extract from Hamish Henderson's first elegy. There are many dead in this brutish desert who lie uneasy among the scrub in this landscape of half-wit stunted ill will. For the dead land is insatiate and necrophilous, the sand is blowing about still. Many who for various reasons or because of mere unanswerable compulsion came here and fought among the clutching gravestones, shivered and sweated, cried out, suffered thirst, were stoically silent, cursed the spittering machine guns, were homesick for Europe and fast embedded in quicksand of Africa, agonized and died, and sleep now, sleep here the sleep of dust. There were our own, there were the others. Their deaths were like their lives, human and animal. There were no gods and precious few heroes. What they regretted when they died had nothing to do with race and leader, realm indivisible, laboured Augustan speeches or vague imperial heritage. They saw through that guff before the axe fell. Their longing turned to the lost world glimpsed in the memory of letters, an evening at the pictures in the friendly dark, two knowing conspirators smiling and whispering secrets. Or else, a family gathering in the homely kitchen with mum so proud of her boys in uniform. Their thoughts trembled between moments of estrangement and ecstatic moments of reconciliation, and their desire crucified itself against the unutterable shadow of someone whose photo was in their wallets. Their death made his incision. There were our own, there were the others. Therefore, minding the great word of Glencoe's son, that we should not disfigure ourselves with villainy of hatred, and seeing that all have gone down like curs into anonymous silence, I will bear witness, for I knew the others. Seeing that literal and interior are alike indifferent, and the birds are drawn again to our welcoming north, why should I not sing them, the dead, the innocent? And as I said, that was Stephen Granger, our Piper, friend, out there on the banks of Loch Lomond playing When the Battle's O'er. So we spoke a bit about what Scots were doing during the war, but at home there was a lot happening as well. So first of all, and this is a man who had a transformative impact on Scotland in so many ways, Murray. Tom Johnson, who was the Secretary of State for Scotland under Churchill. I know this, again, we could talk for hours about him and everything that he did, but could you just give us a wee kind of potted history of Tom Johnson, how he became Secretary of State, and then the kind of power that he had under Churchill?
Well, Johnson was a career Labour politician, but one who was prepared to join the national government, because the coalition government that effectively saw Great Britain out of the Depression and into the Second World War. And he was appointed Secretary of State for Scotland as Churchill's Secretary of State. And he was rather curious. I think very much, if you read his memoirs, a very innovative thinker. I mean, he's about administrative in particular, devolution for Scotland. So first of all, he wanted to set up a Council of State for Scotland made up of all former Scottish secretaries, a kind of national government for Scotland, if you like, in embryo, including secretaries of state from both parties. And he wanted to hold meetings of the Scottish Grand Committee in Scotland, which was actually reverted to as an attempt to head off devolution by the Conservative government after 1992. But the old ones are not always the best in this case. However, it was innovative in the 1940s. So the interesting is that Churchill really let him get on with things. I mean, there's some controversy about how much freedom he actually had, but effectively, Churchill saw Johnson's operation in Scotland as the domestic Scottish side of the overall national government agenda, but not one that he was going to be interested in intervening with in a day-to-day basis, or that he would demand would go in lockstep, for example, to use a phrase, with the rest of the United Kingdom. And Johnson, as a consequence, made some of the most innovative developments of Secretary of State in the 20th century, perhaps most centrally to the Scottish renewable story, the development of the Hydro Board in 1943, and then the work which led up to the creation of the Scottish Tourist Board and SCDI, Development and Industry, Council for Development and Industry in 1946. So you're looking at somebody who, right in the heart of the war, and it wasn't always an easy war in Scotland. There were terrible attacks which may come to the Clydebank Blitz, for example. There were also strikes, and it's easy to forget that actually there was a lot of disquiet on the home front during the war as well. The Church was quite prepared, fundamentally, to let Johnson get on with it and to deliver what you might call Scottish solutions to Scottish problems, albeit in the fairly patrician way that a Secretary of State does. So there's no question that Johnson retains an enormously high status as a Scottish Secretary of State, historically speaking, but not just because he stood up for Scotland, but because that wasn't purely defensive. It was actually creative. He actually thought about what Scotland needed as a separate agenda, not least the rural development. He wasn't thinking in terms of renewable energy, but the rural development that went with hydropower. And he implemented it. And that makes him, so very different from many people who've occupied that position.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about that, the fact that he was given so much freedom under Churchill, who was very much, opposed to Scottish nationalism and to separatism, why was Scotland able to have so much kind of divergence at that time? Was that a principle, or was that just that Churchill was more concerned with thinking about what was happening in the war and didn't have a lot of time to spend thinking about Scotland?
Well, I'm sure. I mean, he needed to be able to trust the Scottish administration, because Scotland was unquestionably a vulnerable point for any potential German invasion, as Gordon Barclay and others have shown. So I think the issue is that Churchill was brought up in a very different world. He was brought up in the world where Scotland was a subsidiary nationality of the British Empire, and in that sense, funnily enough, although they didn't always get on, he was rather like de Gaulle, who was very much conscious of Scottish nationality. So for Churchill, Scotland is an imperial. I mean, it's an imperial nationality. It's a local nationality in the British Empire. And Churchill is a passionate believer in the British Empire. He's not a modern man at all in that sense. And to be Scottish and British was the same as to be New Zealand and British, or Canadian and British. British was an international identity. Scotland was part of it. It was one of the English-speaking peoples, and so I mean, broadly speaking, anyway. And so it was regarded as a home territory in a way. But Churchill understood that it was different, and he had, of course, toyed at least with Scottish Home Rule in the 19 teens and 20s. He was aware of Scottish difference. To an extent, he respected Scottish difference. One mustn't over-exaggerate it. It was in the context of its time, but it's a very different context. It's the context of the Empire Exhibition of 1938, with the big pavilion for Scottish, the Scottish pavilion for national pride, national productivity, national contribution on Scotland's part, and the kind of shape that we've had ever since the Festival of Britain, of there being kind of one British nationality without any multinational elements, and it all has to be understood in singular terms. Churchill didn't belong to that era. He was born in 1874. He was a high imperialist. He understood Scotland as a British nationality, but not as necessarily a British nationality in an undifferentiated way from England.
Okay, that's very interesting. And you mentioned de Gaulle there as well. Could you tell us a bit about the de Gaulle's connection to Scotland and to the kind of the Free French forces in Scotland?
Well, I think one of the things we again, one of the many things we forget about the war and remembering it in this very narrow, particular way is that the Free French were really important. I mean, they were involved. Paris was in the end liberated by the Second Armoured Free French Division on the 25th of August, 1944. They were about, after D-Day, up to 1.3 million Free French forces in Europe, largely formed of French volunteers and from troops from the French colonies, which had not been taken by the Germans and who were not prepared to sign up to supporting Pétain's Vichy regime. So de Gaulle himself was acutely conscious of Scottish nationality. He wanted, when he arrived back in France in 1944, to be met off the plane by a Scots officer, and indeed it took a couple of hours to find a Major Mackintosh to do the honours, and not an English officer. And he was very conscious too of the Scottish legacy in French history. He was himself, his mother's side, descended from families loyal to the exiled Stuarts. And his uncle, Charles de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, was a pan-Celticist who believed in the political and cultural integration of the Celtic nations, Scots, Bretons, Irish, Welsh, and so on. So de Gaulle is a very interesting figure, and in the end, the insignia of the Free French Forces, the Cross of Lorraine, was meant to recollect the Joan of Arc's struggle in the Wars of Independence, particularly in France, to the 100 Years' War, particularly to free the critical siege of Orléans in 1429. And de Gaulle was very well aware of the role that Scots troops had played from Bourget to Orléans in the freeing of France in that period. So that the actual insignia of the Free French itself is redolent of the Scottish contribution to medieval Franco-English conflict. It's very interesting, and I think very understood is that. And to this day, La Marche des Soldats de Robert Bruce, the March of the Soldiers of Robert Bruce, is one of the key French military marches, and was used, for example, as recently as 2019 at a state funeral for two French special forces who'd been killed in an operation in Burkina Faso. So these things are very much in de Gaulle's mind, not in everybody's mind, but de Gaulle came from that background and they were in his mind.
Yeah, and of course there's a memorial still in is Greenock, isn't it?
Yes, in Ivista Greenock in 42, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry, Ellen, I realise we've been leaving you out of the discussion a wee bit here. I appreciate you're not a Scottish historian. How does it make you feel to hear all of this history? What does it mean to you when you hear some of this stuff?
I mean, I'm interested in history no matter what side it's from. History is where we find the lessons for the future and find clues as to our present. So I used to live in Greenock. I saw that monument. In my time in Scotland, I learned an awful lot that I just, that the education that I received in Germany and the way that we were taught about the Second World War and the Nazi era was very much centered around understanding guilt and understanding the consequence of that guilt, which has to be responsibility and not just a helpless bug turned on its back with its arms waving in the air. You are responsible for the present, and that is what you need to look on. And learning about Scotland and how far up this war went up into the north. We know much more about Europe, and just hearing about Clydebank and how it got bombed out, knowing about the bunker history that is still present and lying in underneath and around Greenock. It blew my mind, and it's important to engage with this history, not just for me as a German Scot, but as a human being, and especially human beings that we are here in Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we do move on again, you mentioned there the Clydebank Blitz. Murray, this was one of the most kind of devastating direct impacts of the war on Scotland. Could you tell us just a little bit about that and how big an event it was?
Well, it was a huge event. I mean, I think Germany was for the first aware of Scottish heavy industry. The very first shots in the air war were fired in engagement over the Forth in 1939. And obviously Clyde shipping and the supply of Clyde shipping was key to the British war effort. So they're around about, this is the key night of the Clydebank Blitz is the 13th to 14th March 1941. There are around 260 German bombers involved, and they have a huge effect. I mean, Clydebank is fundamentally flattened. There are 1,100 casualties, about half of those are killed, but almost as significant is that there are 48,000 homeless. Now, the population of Clydebank today is around about 30,000. Then it was a bit more than 50,000. But you're looking at basically a town where almost everybody has lost their homes. And one of the other interesting things about this, terrible attack, which is the most significant single attack on Scotland in World War II, is that a large part of the resistance in terms of firepower from the ground came from the Polish destroyer, the ORP Piorun, which defended Clydebank. It was one of the 4 Polish destroyers who actually given asylum, if you like, if you can give a destroyer asylum, in Scotland in 1939 after the fall of Poland. So, I mean, just as there were around about 150 Czech and Polish pilots involved in the Battle of Britain, so in the defense of the Clydebank and the Blitz, a Polish ship was key. And of course, there were very many Polish forces throughout Scotland at that time and throughout World War II, not just the destroyer squadron, but there was the Polish Staff College, the Polish Record Office, the Polish paratroops, and 3 Polish brigades with reserve troops at different times. And the extent to which Poles settled in Scotland after the war and became, if you like, a first generation of new Polish Scots, not in the post-free movement period, but in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, owes a great deal to that legacy. And that legacy was showed its value in the defense of Clydebank during the Blitz and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. We do owe a great debt, especially as you say, to those Polish soldiers. But when we think about moving on from the war, obviously, as you say, there were a great many Polish people settled here. We also began to see a number of other kind of big developments in British society. We saw the empire start to break down, and we saw also other waves of immigration from parts of the empire in the kind of years not long after the war. How big a difference was there between the British society post-war and pre-war? How big of a difference did the war make in that change?
The war seemed to make a little difference, but in fact stored up the idea of a great difference, because what happened was, first of all, as I've suggested, the 45-51 government continued the war spirit, in some cases designedly, by actually prolonging rationing beyond the time when it was actually needed. So they were trying to create and maintain and extend the war spirit. At the same time, the beginnings of the dissolution of the British Empire started to actually associate the maintenance of the war spirit with hanging on to something that was disappearing. And it made quite a significant difference that by the time you got to the 1950s, in some ways, British society was actually not as developed, as free, as liberal as it had been in the late 1930s. But in other ways, it was wholly changed because it was no longer a major imperial power. And of course, the attempts to hang on to that in Suez and in particular were very manifest. So I think the loss of empire is ultimately more important than World War II. But the reaction to World War II by attempting to prolong it into the 50s in the context of the beginning of the loss of empire has left a legacy where we still want to hang on to its memory, or because it's the last time in which Britain and the British Empire were important. In a sense, the answer to World War II was change and modernization. And that was an answer that had to be carried out in continental Europe before, because there was so much destruction. But despite the Blitz and the bombing raids and so on, and remember that a lot of bomb site destruction was not actually sorted out in the UK until the 1960s and 70s, if then. It was hardly kind of rebuilt all of a sudden. A lot of it just hung around and was part of the industrial decay. There wasn't the sense of rebuilding. There was the sense of hanging on to the last time that it meant something to be British and to be imperial. And that in a sense has actually created some of the change that we still live with.
Yeah. And Ellen, I mean, obviously, as Murray said, Germany had to rebuild in so many ways, not just the physical infrastructure that was just destroyed during the war, but its whole structures of governance and the way it organized itself as a country, because the Nazis had done so much to kind of spread their ideology and their people into every corner of society. So we get the division of Germany first of all, but then relatively quickly we move into the economic miracle. How does Germany look at that period immediately after the war? What's the thought process on how Germany responded and what Germany's response continues to be, I guess?
I think that's two very distinct things. If you talk to my father's and mother's generation, they will remember the after-war period as their youth, and as rebellious teenagers a bit further down the line. They will have been the ones that very clearly noticed that while the war was over and there was not a Nazi regime in power at the time, these people hadn't gone away, and in fact quite a lot of the people that held the same ideologies were still finding themselves in a similar place. Yes, the systems had been swapped out, but it isn't as easy as declaring a war over. And I think this whole lack of restructuring initially was powered by something that is very similar in the UK, but has its own kind of branch of that. It's to do with not really wanting to forget the glory that came with being this, powerful nation that people want to fight with. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, not wanting to remember the horrible things that happened. When my grandmother came to Germany after the war, she was lumped in with everybody else, and everybody had to go and see these education films about what was happening in the concentration camps, what Nazi Germany had done to the overall population and to the minorities in the population. And there was so much trauma that my grandfather, the man that she ended up marrying, he continued to be depressed for his entire life. He wasn't a fervent Nazi by any stretch. He was conscripted and hadn't intended to go down that route. But the war traumatized him in his own right, and he never became a happy person afterwards. So there's a whole generation where looking away was the easiest thing to do. Germany really picked up in the 70s and 80s, as far as I'm aware, and that had a lot of power behind it, a bit like in the UK it was powered by, the financial boom that was happening in the 80s, and there's this new culture coming in where everything is really swanky, but it kind of detaches from the old but brings in a new reign of something that is questionable to some, the neoliberalism that has brought about many of the changes that are currently failing society. Germany had something quite similar, but there are several cultural differences between our place and Germany. And one of the main differences that I can tell, and could tell straight away when I came to the UK as a teenager, was that here the emphasis on meeting a stranger brand new is very much on, are they a good laugh? Can they take a joke? Specifically in England, as a German, can they take a joke? Can be a quite painful affair. In Germany, it is much more about, can they hold a conversation? Can they hold their own? Is there a logical base to their arguments? And I think that is something that Germans are known for, methodical and, a cohesive approach to logic and structuring. And that obviously helped Germany in general and has made it possible for it to retain a manufacturing industry that the UK essentially just completely sold out and gave away.
Yeah. And when we look at Europe in the post-war period, obviously the European Union, what was then the coal and steel community, was set up specifically to stop France and Germany being able to go to war with each other. The point was, if they were kind of tied together in their coal and steel industries, then it was going to be very difficult for them to make war, because you needed coal and steel to do that. And obviously the EU has developed in a whole variety of ways. It's gone far beyond just coal and steel now. But to what extent is that intention of the European project in Germany still at the forefront of people's minds? How much do people know that the point of it was to prevent war, and is that still why people support it?
I think this is a quite interesting question, and I think there's a huge gap between how the UK interprets the European Union and how Germany and the rest of Central Europe, at the very least, interprets what the European Union is. To the UK, the founding of the European Union was always an economic decision, much more than an emotional decision to bring nations closer together to prevent war. The UK was only has become again only interested in economic arrangements around the concept of a closer collaboration between nations. For Germany, it is very, very much a heart issue, an emotional fact. We know that the major wars that have been going on were before the founding of Europe, and we want to keep it that way. And to me, it's often quite laughable to see how the UK values something that has brought peace so little over something that may or may not bring money, especially in the case of Brexit. It is obviously a very hard economic point to make about Brexit. It will not go well for the UK. But even that it has been made about an economic decision, and it shouldn't be that way, considering that the UK was one of the nations quite severely affected by very hostile civil war, especially in Ireland. Something that has also been pushed away and doesn't really fit into the self-image of a nation that is better than anybody else, rule Britannia and all that. So yeah, for Germany, the EU is much more than a financial investment. It's an emotional, moral thing to do to keep peace.
And Murray, if I could just come back to you, we've only got a few minutes left, but when you maybe look forward to another major anniversary, maybe towards the 100th, when we'll have no survivors of the war left, barely anybody who can remember that period at all, what's your hope for how Scotland can still remember the war and still acknowledge the war, maybe without some of the negative characteristics that we've talked about today?
I think that the best way to avert any future tragedies is to remember war as a tragedy and not to use it as a support mechanism for contemporary rhetoric or a way of occluding some of the terrors that you claim to be remembering. One of the things I find very disturbing in current remembrance is the extent of the focus, quite rightly, the extent of the focus on the Holocaust in education, in remembrance of the war, goes together with a rise in xenophobia and specifically a rise in reported anti-Semitic incidents in the UK in the last few years. And I just think that the way we remember the war does not learn the lessons of war. And they are sad lessons, but they are not lessons about having commemorative medals and putting out bunting and all being jolly because we won. Because in the end, there is no real victor in war. War is an immense social cost to everybody, some of it in terms of trauma, misery, and deprivation and family loss that concealed from the parade and the talk of victory. So I think we should remember war as a tragedy, and we should also remember it comprehensively and for all that were involved, not just for a few. And those two go together. Yeah.
And Ellen, just a wee last word for you. What would your hope be for how we can remember the war in Scotland in the future?
I'm not sure I've got the right to say that. I hope that we will use this day as a point to remember the end of a horrible war, and I hope we will use the other 355 days of the year to do better, to come together, to be inclusive, to make progressive policies, and to not divide ourselves, neither from, especially for the independence movement. We may be going further and we may be going our own way, but we continue to be friends. And we have to view it that way. Our closest neighbors have to be our allies. Their suffering is our suffering. I hope no matter who comes into this country and who goes out of it, we'll carry a message of freedom.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to end then, I think. As I said, there's so much more we could have discussed here. Any one of these questions, I think, could have filled the whole hour, but we only had an hour, so that's what we've done. So I'd like to thank you both for joining us, Ellen Höfer and Professor Murray Pittock. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And before we go, we're going to hear again from our piper, Stephen Granger. He's going to play The Floors of the Forest, which, of course, was written to commemorate loss of loss of life at Flodden hundreds of years ago, part of ancient history now. But that still brings to mind the pain of the loss that so many people feel from war. So again, thank you to Professor Murray Pittock. Thank you to Ellen. I'm sure we'll talk to them both again. But as we play out with the pipes, just thank you very much from me. For you for joining us tonight. It's been an interesting show, a different kind of show, and I hope one that has helped to remember the tragedy of war and in an appropriate way. So thank you and good night.